Virginity, a single word that has condemned women to death, sparked wars, and shaped the fate of entire dynasties. Throughout history, this invisible mark of purity has wielded more power than armies, with societies constructing elaborate systems of control around its preservation, verification, and often, its artificial recreation. The lengths humans would go to maintain this illusion would prove more horrifying than any battlefield. Join us as we explore the shocking lies behind virginity, uncovering the sad stories and looking at the lasting effects of this controversial practice. Welcome to History Beast. Different cultures throughout history came up with various ways to check if a woman was a virgin. And honestly, some of these practices were pretty shocking. Let's look at how this played out around the world. In ancient Babylon, around 1894 BCE, they had this big yearly ceremony that was a really big deal. It's a spiritual performance where a priestess who had to be a virgin would take part in a ceremony with the city's ruler. It was more like a play where she represented a goddess named Inanna, and he played the god Dumuzi. Being a virgin wasn't just about her personal life. People believed it gave her special spiritual powers. Things got even more intense in medieval Europe. Between the 500s and 1400s, they had what they called the cloth test. When a couple got married, they had to spend their first night together on white sheets. The next morning, people would actually check the sheets for blood, which they thought proved the bride was a virgin. If they didn't find what they were looking for, it could ruin a woman's life. Over in Japan, during a time called the Heian period, between 794 and 1185, they did something completely different. Women who were about to get married would dye their teeth black in a process called ohaguro. While people said it was just about looking beautiful, it was really their way of marking a woman's change from being unmarried to being a wife. The Yoruba people in West Africa had their own tradition. They also used a white cloth, but in their own way. After a couple's wedding night, everyone would gather to check the cloth for blood stains. If they found them, it was party time. If they didn't, well, let's just say it meant serious trouble for the bride and her family. And then there were the ancient Maya people. After a woman's wedding night, her own mother would have to check the sheets. Finding no blood stains wasn't just embarrassing. People thought it was a really bad sign that would bring shame to the whole family. Just imagine having your mom check your sheets, with your entire future hanging on what she found. We cannot overlook the biblical perspective when discussing virginity. For centuries, the Bible has been shaping how people think about virginity, and some of these ideas are still with us today. Let's look at how this played out through history. Perhaps the most famous story about virginity in the Bible is that of Mary, Jesus' mother. According to the Gospel of Luke, an angel named Gabriel told Mary she would have a baby while still being a virgin. Pretty mind-blowing news. This story didn't just make headlines back then. It actually set the standard for how Christian societies would view virginity for centuries to come. But not all biblical stories about virginity were so gentle. In the Old Testament, things got pretty harsh. Take the book of Deuteronomy, for example. It laid down some scary rules. If a bride couldn't prove she was a virgin, she could be dragged to her father's doorstep and stoned to death. Yeah, it was that serious. The Bible is full of stories about virgins, each teaching different lessons. There's this interesting story about 10 virgins waiting for a bridegroom, meant to represent Jesus. Half of them brought extra oil for their lamps. Smart thinking. While the others didn't, not so smart. When the bridegroom showed up at midnight, only the prepared ones got to join the party. The message? Being a virgin wasn't just about physical purity. It was about being spiritually ready too. Then there's the heartbreaking story of Jephthah's daughter. Her dad, a warrior, made a rash promise to sacrifice the first person he saw after winning a battle. Guess who came running out to congratulate him? His own daughter. She spent her last 2 months alive wandering the mountain, mourning the fact she'd never get married or have kids. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, 500s to 1400s, and things get really interesting. Virginity wasn't just about religion anymore. It became a political power move. During this time, nobles ran everything through a system called feudalism. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about power, land, and making strong family connections. A bride's virginity was like a seal of quality, proving her family's honor and making her more valuable in marriage negotiations. Here's a real example. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the richest women in Europe, married Louis VII of France in 1137. Her virginity was part of the package deal that helped seal this major political alliance. It wasn't just about her, it was about joining two powerful regions together. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of virgin saints, holy women like Saint Cecilia and Saint Agnes, who were celebrated for their purity. Their stories were told over and over in churches, making virginity seem even more special and sacred. Even the love stories of the time were all about virginity. Knights in shining armor would go on dangerous quests to prove themselves worthy of pure virgin noblewomen. Famous writers like Geoffrey Chaucer wrote about this in the Canterbury Tales, helping spread these ideas about love, honor, and purity throughout society. The wild thing is, many of these medieval ideas about virginity, honor, and purity stuck around for centuries, and some people still believe in them today. Throughout history, women have had to come up with some pretty creative and often dangerous ways to fake being virgins. Why? Because in many societies, a woman's whole future could depend on whether people believe she was pure or not. Let's start way back in ancient Rome, around 27 BC. Back then, if you weren't a virgin on your wedding night, you were in big trouble. One Roman writer tells us about a woman named Marcia who came up with a desperate solution. She used aloe vera to make her body seem like that of a virgin. Think about that. Women were using plant extracts just to meet society's impossible standards. Things got interesting in the Middle Ages in Europe between 500 and 1500 AD. Women were using something called St. Hildegard's dew, basically a mixture of herbs like fennel and pennyroyal that was supposed to make everything tighter. Named after a famous nun, this DIY solution shows just how desperate women were to meet these strict social rules. But here's where it gets really wild. In 18th century France, some women were using chicken blood to fake virginity. And this wasn't just happening in Europe. From China to India, women were doing similar things. It's pretty shocking to think about how widespread these practices were. Some cultures even developed fake hymen. These were especially common in parts of the Middle East and Asia, where proving virginity could literally be a matter of life and death. Today, things have gotten more high-tech, but not necessarily better. Now there's actual surgery called hymenoplasty that can restore virginity. It became popular in the late 1900s and is still done today, though doctors argue about whether it's right or wrong to do these procedures. Let's talk about a teenage girl who changed the course of history, Joan of Arc. Born in 1412 in a tiny French village called Domremy, she was known as the Maid, and her story shows just how powerful the idea of virginity was in medieval times. Imagine a 13-year-old girl starts having visions of saints telling her she needs to help save France from the English during the 100 Years' War. Pretty wild, right? But here's the thing. People actually listened to her. Why? A big part of it was because she was a virgin, which back then was seen as a sign that God was on your side. When Joan finally got to meet Charles VII, the guy who was supposed to be King of France, he didn't just take her word for it. He had doctors and religious experts examine her. They checked two things. Was she mentally sound, and you guessed it, was she really a virgin? When both checks came back positive, it was like getting God's stamp of approval. Suddenly, this teenage girl had enough authority to lead an army. And lead she did. Joan helped score a massive victory at Orleans in May 1429, turning the whole war around for France. But success came with a price. The English and their allies wanted her badly, and in 1430 they finally caught her. While in prison, Joan wore men's clothes, not as a fashion statement, but to protect herself from being assaulted. She famously said it was better to wear soldiers' pants than risk being attacked. But ironically, wearing men's clothing became one of the charges used against her in court. Despite being interrogated under horrible conditions, Joan never backed down. But in the end, her enemies found a way to get rid of her. They declared her a heretic, someone who goes against the church. And in 1431, they burned her at the stake. She was just 19 years old. 25 years later, the same church that condemned her admitted they were wrong and called her a martyr instead. But it took until 1920, almost 500 years after her death, for the Catholic Church to officially make her a saint. And yes, the fact that she was a virgin was still being talked about, even then. Imagine turning down marriage proposals from some of the most powerful men in the world and using your single status to become one of history's greatest rulers. That's exactly what Elizabeth I did, and her story is fascinating. Born in 1533 to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's early life wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Her father had her mother executed when she was just 3 years old, and she went from princess to illegitimate child faster than you could say daddy issues. But this tough start might have been what made her such a smart and strategic ruler later on. Unlike most girls of her time, who were lucky if they learned to read, Elizabeth got the kind of education usually reserved for princes. She studied languages, math, and politics. Those lessons would come in handy sooner than anyone expected. When Elizabeth became queen at 25, England was a mess. The country was divided over religion, broke, and politically unstable. But Elizabeth had an unusual plan to fix things. She would use her single status as a political weapon. In a time when most people thought a woman couldn't rule without a husband, Elizabeth flipped the script. She basically said, "I'm married to England." Her famous quote puts it perfectly. "I will have but one mistress here and no master." In other words, I'm the boss. Deal with it. But she wasn't just playing hard to get. Elizabeth knew that marrying a foreign prince would mean giving away some of England's power, and she wasn't having any of that. Instead, she kept all these powerful men on the hook. She'd entertain their proposals, let them think they had a chance, but never actually say yes. This way, she kept their countries as allies without giving up any control. Over her 44-year reign, being the Virgin Queen became Elizabeth's brand. Artists painted her as various virgin goddesses, and poets wrote about her purity. There's even this famous painting called The Siege of Mons that shows her with an ermine, a type of weasel known for its white fur, at her feet, a symbol of purity. The painting's Latin inscription calls her the undefiled lily among thorns, which was basically the 16th century version of a PR campaign. When European colonizers sailed across the world, they didn't just bring their weapons and diseases, they brought their ideas too. And one of their most powerful weapons turned out to be their strict views about virginity and women's purity. Think about what happened when Columbus and other Spanish explorers arrived in the Americas in the 1400s. They found cultures like the Arawak people, who were pretty open about courtship and didn't obsess over virginity. But the Spanish weren't having it. They looked at these different customs and basically said, "That's uncivilized, you need to do things our way." The same thing happened in Africa during the 1800s when European powers took over. Before colonization, many African societies had their own unique ways of celebrating womanhood and relationships. But European colonizers dismissed these traditions as barbaric and forced their own ideas about virginity and purity onto these cultures. India tells an especially interesting story. When the British took over, they brought their strict Victorian ideas about pleasure and virginity with them. This clashed big time with existing Indian traditions, including some that actually saw physical intimacy as something spiritual. The British just ignored these ancient customs and pushed their own rules instead. There's this remarkable story about an Indian woman named Rukma Bai that really shows what was happening. In the late 1800s, she made headlines by refusing to live with the husband she'd been forced to marry as a child. A writer named Aimé Césaire from Martinique put it perfectly when he said the colonizers loved to brag about the progress they brought, like curing diseases and building railways, but they never talked about what they destroyed along the way. And they destroyed a lot. Even though colonialism officially ended, these imposed ideas about virginity stuck around. Many cultures are still dealing with these leftover Victorian-era attitudes long after the colonizers went home. It's like the colonizers left, but their rulebook stayed behind, still controlling people's lives generations later. When Queen Victoria took the British throne in 1837, she ushered in an era that would take society's obsession with virginity to new extremes. Picture a world where your entire future could be destroyed by a love letter or an unchaperoned conversation. Victorian writers couldn't get enough of this obsession. Authors like Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy used the symbol of the pure, innocent lamb to represent virginal women. Take Hardy's famous novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It tells the heartbreaking story of a pure woman whose life is ruined after losing her virginity through deception. The message was clear. Lose your virginity. Lose everything. Even scientists got in on the act. Dr. William Acton, a prominent Victorian physician, came up with the ridiculous two spheres theory, claiming women naturally had no desire for intimacy. Yet the Victorian obsession with virginity wasn't just about social control. It gave rise to something even more insidious, the hymen myth. This seemingly scientific idea claimed you could tell if someone was a virgin by checking their hymen, a small membrane in the female reproductive system. This myth wasn't new. The ancient Greeks came up with it, but it gained a dangerous new legitimacy in the hands of Victorian doctors. Fast forward to 1998, when Dr. Sarah Patterson Brown finally proved what many had long suspected. Hymens come in all shapes and sizes, and some women are born without them. But by then, the damage was done. For centuries, women had been subjected to humiliating virginity tests. Even in 2019, the World Health Organization had to officially speak out against these tests, showing just how persistent this myth remains. As society grappled with these scientific theories about virginity, world events would add another dark chapter to this story. When World War I and II erupted, the obsession with female purity took an even more sinister turn. Women were suddenly divided into two extreme categories: the pure patriotic heroines keeping the home fires burning, and the fallen women who didn't fit this ideal. This division had brutal consequences. Consider the comfort women, thousands of Korean and Chinese women forced into slavery for pleasure satisfaction by the Japanese military. Their story remained hidden until 1991, when Kim Hak-soon bravely spoke out about her experiences. In France, women accused of relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through streets, while their pure counterparts were celebrated as patriots. Throughout these dark times, however, voices of resistance emerged. The Victorian era had Josephine Butler, who campaigned against unfair laws targeting pleasure workers, and Florence Nightingale, who chose her career over marriage. As Simone de Beauvoir later pointed out, the real problem was how society defined women only in relation to men. This insight helps explain why the obsession with virginity has been so persistent. It was never really about women's choices, but about control. From ancient herbal concoctions to modern surgical procedures, women still face pressure to conform to ideals of purity. Looking back on this history, it's clear that the story of virginity is really a story about power. Who has it, who wants it, and how it's used to control others. If you found this look at the shocking lies behind virginity interesting and learned something new, please like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating content about science and history. Thanks for watching.